Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. We respectfully advise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that this podcast contains the names of deceased Aboriginal persons. Additionally, some historical quotes include language that may be offensive. The Newcastle Family History Society does not condone such language. This episode of Birds of a Feather explores the relationships between the European settlements of Coal River and the First Nations peoples. As Newcastle's penal settlement grew, figures like Commandant Wallis and artist Joseph Lycett navigated a world where art, survival and power intertwined with Indigenous knowledge and guidance. Burigon, an esteemed elder of the Awabakal people, played a crucial role in bridging these worlds, providing insight, collaboration, and at times, tentative trust. Join Narelle Austin as she uncovers the stories of Wallis, Burigon and Lycett, an unlikely trio whose interactions preserved Aboriginal knowledge and captured glimpses of a culture under immense change.
Here in Newcastle in 1814, our literary artist James Wallis escaped assignment in the coal mines and secured a measure of protection by helping Commandant Scotto as a translator of convicts' flash language. However, Scotto was moving on and up the ranks. James Wallis was to stay in Newcastle for some time. What would the new Commandant Thompson require on his arrival in February 1814? Wallis's fellow convicts knew of his betrayal with the dictionary, even though it had not yet been published. He was in real danger. James Wallis had made it known that he was working on another manuscript. The latter was to be published with his dictionary of flash language as his memoirs, entitled Memoirs of the First 32 Years of the Life of James Wallis, a Swindler and Pickpocket, now transported for the second time, and for life, to New South Wales, written by himself. Perhaps Thomas Thompson hoped that Wallis would speak well of him in his memoirs as his commandant in Newcastle. In that manner, Wallis could have hoped for some protection and a continuation of his privileges. In 1818, Wallis was in possession of 2 houses and in a position to marry while in Newcastle. In 1815, Sydney was flooded with 5-shilling notes drawn on the postmaster of the colony. As a known and skillful forger, the convict Joseph Lycett was under suspicion, and a search by authorities found a small copperplate press in his possession. So Lycett was sent to Newcastle penal settlement in July. In June 1816, Thomas Thompson moved on, and James Wallis became the Newcastle commandant. Wallis, a complex figure, was to assemble his own flock of visual artists. Richard Brown had remained. Walter Preston had arrived in Newcastle in 1814 as an engraver who had collaborated in Sydney with Absalom West, and Joseph Lycett, who was toiling in the coal mines. Walter Preston was an engraver who was found guilty of forgery and highway robbery in England in 1811 and sent to a prison hulk aptly named Retribution. In 1812, he arrived in the colony of New South Wales on the same ship as William Craig, the Guildford. He attempted to abscond from Sydney and was therefore sent to Newcastle penal settlement in December 1814. At that time, Newcastle was under the control of Commandant Thompson. Walter Preston was 37 when he was sentenced to the secondary penal settlement at Coal River. In the unrelenting heat of January, he worked in the lime-burning kilns at Newcastle, but absconded from the gang 10 months later. He was returned to Newcastle and was fortunate to be chosen by the new commandant, James Wallis, to collaborate as an engraver based on paintings by Joseph Lycett. His skills as an engraver were used by several commandants at Newcastle to produce their works for publication. The Australian Dictionary of Biography informs us that Lycett's lot became relatively easy after Wallis became commandant. Joseph Lycett was a watercolourist and Commandant Wallis was an enthusiastic amateur painter Wallis was interested in using and perhaps learning from Joseph Lycett's well-known skills. From 1816 to 1818, Commandant Wallis and Joseph Lycett collaborated on various artistic projects which were part of Wallis's ambitious building plans for the settlement. Though Lycett was not an architect, Commandant Wallis had him draw up plans for Christ Church. Lycett also painted the altarpiece and produced 3 lead-light windows, which still survive in Christ Church Cathedral today. Joseph Lycett was to be rewarded with preferential treatment and eventually an absolute pardon for his collaborative artistic work. He had his wife Mary and children join him in the colony and attracted the attention of Governor Macquarie, and so to his powerful contact, Lord Bathurst, who promoted his work. He was also able to return to England. Commandant Wallis had a friendship with the First Nations man Burigon, esteemed elder of the Awabakal people. Wallis had expeditions with his companion, who was also his guide and liaison with the local people. Wallis was also interested in recording the local environment and the local people, to whom his friend Burigon facilitated access. With the indispensable help of Burigon, Wallis and his coterie would produce, amongst other colonial testimonies, the acclaimed Wallis Album. As well, this relationship allowed Brown and Lycett to sketch the flora and fauna and paint the people and their ceremonies. Lycett was passionate about painting the local environment, its people, and their customs, and this is evident in his work. David Andrew Roberts, in the online database of historical materials relating to Aborigines of the Newcastle and Lake Macquarie region, gives his assessments of the early relationships between the military settlement and the local people. In the following extract from Aborigines, Commandants and Convicts, the Newcastle Penal Settlement, Roberts begins by describing the character of first contacts around Newcastle and other frontier areas which were influenced by a demographic and cultural catastrophe immediately after the arrival of the Europeans. There was a devastating virgin soil outbreak of smallpox among Australian Aborigines, witnessed by the First Fleet on the shores of Sydney Harbour in 1789, which probably killed up to 1/3 of the population of the Newcastle Lake Macquarie region. Though Aboriginal smallpox did not originate with Europeans, there is no doubt the disaster plunged Aboriginal society into a serious and decisive crisis. It can be said with certainty that smallpox weakened Aboriginal resistance to European conquest and was a key factor shaping Aboriginal responses to the arrival of the Europeans. However, the relationships between Aborigines and Europeans at Newcastle were, on the whole, relatively harmonious. In a letter from Commandant Charles Menzies to Governor King, dated the 1st of July 1804.
We always have been and still continue on the most friendly terms with the numerous natives here, to preserve which I have directed the storekeeper to victual Bungaree. He is the most intelligent of that race I have as yet seen, and should a misunderstanding unfortunately take place, he will be sure to reconcile them.
Roberts goes on to say, the later commandants managed to maintain the ordered relationship, still evident when Governor Macquarie inspected the settlement in 1818 and in 1821. As a rule, communication between convicts and Aborigines in the settlement would have been discouraged, but probably could not have been prevented without giving some offence or provocation to Aboriginal people. The tensions and tragedies arising from racial conflict were not clearly evident during the years of the Newcastle convict settlement. The penal establishment was a confined and reasonably well-supervised operation, posing little threat to the freedom and survival of local Aboriginal peoples. Clearly, Aborigines welcomed the opportunities for trade and material acquisition. Aborigines traded meat and fish for blankets and clothing. The Newcastle settlement became a principal site of cross-cultural trade that was quickly and firmly embedded in the Aboriginal economy. Indeed, the penal function of the settlement, requiring isolation and strict government military control, stalled a more intensive exploitation of the region by private capitalists for almost 2 decades. It was after the closure of the penal settlement, with the onset of an effusive, unregulated, and extremely destructive private pastoral frontier, that the violence and dispossession ensued. We know that First Nations people became invaluable guides, trackers of escaped convicts, and labourers who cut and carried wood and water for the settlement in a mutually beneficial relationship with the Europeans in the relatively small and controlled environment. And so, in the light of these observations, we can now further explore the extant representations of the local people and the environment at Newcastle, which were painted by the amateur artist Commandant James Wallis, who made use of the skills of Richard Brown, Walter Preston as engraver, and Joseph Lycett, all of whom were helped by Burigon. The following is an excerpt from James Wallis's recollections of Burigon in the manuscript available in the Mitchell Library. Here he comments on drawings by Richard Brown, his relationship with Burigon, and treasured memories of his time as Commandant.
The sketches are likenesses of two brothers of the Newcastle tribe. Burigon, commonly called Jack, was the elder and chieftain of his tribe. He was a keen, shrewd fellow, attached to me and to the Europeans generally from interested motives, for we often administered to his wants, though they are not as numerous as ours. Still, savages have them. A tomahawk, a fish hook, tobacco, sugar, rum, kangaroo, and in cold weather a blanket were objects of Jack's ambition.
Wallis goes on to say,
I now remember poor Jack the black savage ministering to my pleasures, fishing, kangaroo hunting, guiding me through trackless forests, with more kindly feelings than I do many of my own colour kindred nation. Jack proved his attachment and confidence by giving me his only son, a fine boy 10 years old, to be sent to the native establishment formed at Parramatta by the late, benevolent and truly philanthropic Governor Macquarie. Jack's career has been, I understand, since terminated by a treacherous stab from a convict, who by his execution soon after paid in this world the forfeit of his crime, and was the first European that suffered for an Aboriginal native of New Holland.
To shed more light on the subject, we can access the online documentary film, Wallis and Lycett, Unlikely Preservers of Aboriginal Knowledge. This film was produced in 2021 by the Stories of Our Town project, which shows us the time before the momentous changes that occurred after the closure of Newcastle Penal Settlement. The project team interviewed over 150 Novocastrians to tell their mostly untold stories. The film begins by mentioning the other two paths which crossed in 1816, those of Commandant James Wallis and Joseph Lycett, which created an art explosion, making use of the artistic skills of the convicts. It's like stepping back in time, showing Aboriginal life as it was, a rich cultural lifestyle, gifted to us by the most unlikely alliances. One interviewee tells us that the paintings are like looking at family albums. Another states that no one could have captured these aspects of Aboriginal life without the acceptance and a connection to the Aboriginal community in the region. In the film, we hear that James Wallis was an amateur artist, not one of the greatest artists, it must be said, but these things would not have eventuated if Wallis hadn't had the capacity and interest and the kind of means to do it. The Newcastle Art Gallery collection offers us an invaluable image of the social life of the settlement, with a scene of various hunters, Wallis and Burigon, convict helper, and dogs, returning to the settlement, with the plumes of smoke coming from the north, past Stockton, as evidence of the traditional custodians, the Warramai people's presence, and the management of the environment. There are many stories, records, research projects, exhibitions, and a theatrical performance in the making about this serendipitous, creative time in the early settlement at Newcastle. There are also later artists such as Close who contribute to our knowledge of life as it was in Newcastle. It does appear that before the closure of the penal settlement, there was a period of relatively harmonious collaboration between the people who found themselves on the shores and environs of Coal River. Of course, only for the selected few whose skills and connections could be used for protection and self-promotion. To end this podcast, we return to our celebrated artist, Joseph Lycett. He was a man who felt and drank deeply. One of his admirers, Commissioner John Thomas Bigg, on hearing of his suicide years later in London, attested to his troubled nature, which he witnessed during his time in Sydney and Newcastle. Commissioner Bigg is noted as saying that Lycett showed habits of intoxication that were fixed and incurable. The end of his life has been regretted and mourned and represented in many places. For a time, Lycett had the patronage, interest, understanding and friendship of the others who coincided with him in the hellhole of brutality, which for most was Newcastle penal settlement. It must be noted that neither Lycett, Brown, Preston, Wallis nor Scotto would have been able to produce for us these unique artefacts from a time now flown without the cooperation of the local First Nations people.
In episode 5, the last in our current series, we will explore the lives of Commandant Wallis and some other talented convicts who remained in the Coal River Penal Settlement from around 1816, as well as the prominent artists whose accomplishments we have previously explored. We will take a look at the backgrounds and collaboration of 3 more convicts: the entrepreneur and landholder Molly Morgan, carpenter and guard Thomas Joe the Marine Hunt, and the carpenter, supervisor and landholder Patrick Riley. Unlike the visual and literary artists, these 3 were to remain in Newcastle and subsequently develop the settlement at Wallis Plains in the Hunter Valley. Be sure to join us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.